Welcome everyone to GenSafe Workplaces Specialty Series. I'm Aisha, Senior Associate for Programs and Outreach from United Women Singapore. Now, UWS is a Singapore NGO where we aim to advance women's empowerment and gender equality through our programs and partnerships. GenSafe Workplaces program was created by UWS in 2020 to help companies create a safer and more supportive workplace for employees who are impacted by violence. Now, this is the fifth session of the series, and we are discussing the issue of managing personnel who are impacted by domestic violence. Now, last year, Singapore Police received about 5,135 police reports for offences associated with domestic violence. The national lockdown restrictions introduced in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and increased numbers of employees working from home have significantly reduced potential escape routes for victims from abusive situations. So, given the prevalence of domestic abuse, most organizations will have employees who are impacted by it in one way or another by the issue. So our role is to help organizations understand how it is not immune to its impact, and also help their employees from leaving or losing their jobs due to its spillover effect at the workplace. Now, today is also a special session as it is launched in collaboration with KeyNote Womens Speakers. This is one of the world's leading directory of female public speakers, which aims to bring diversity to speaking stages all around the world. I now have the pleasure of introducing our speakers. Now, firstly, we have Abam Mambo, and she is the Regional Legal Director of Microsoft. She will speak about how organizations can play an active supporting role and the strategies that the companies of all sizes can choose to adopt to support and retain employees, drawing from her experience as a lawyer with an MNC. And we have also Anita Kapoor, and she is a television host, facilitator, and speaker. She will discuss how employers can make a big difference to survivors and their future. So, Anita will share her views from a societal and human perspective on this issue. Natalia Rachel, right, is the executive director from the Soma Clinic, and she will share what it means to be a trauma-informed organization and understanding what trauma looks like to the survivors of abuse and how knowing this will help companies create effective policies and strategies to support their impacted employees. So if you have any questions for the speakers during their respective segment, please type your questions in the Q&A box below. We will try our best to select and address those questions to the speakers at the end of their segment during the Q&A session. We will also be sharing the participants' presentation deck post-event. So sit back and enjoy today's session. Without further delay, I would like to now hand over to Abam.
Thank you, Aisha. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Is net head nod? Okay. Thank you. And at any point, if I'm having a glitch, I'll trust my co-moderators here to just let me know if I'm freezing, and I'll take care of that. On behalf of KeyNote Women Speaker, myself, Natalia, and Anita are really happy to be here with you this morning. And Aisha and the United Women Singapore, thank you for having us. My name is Abam Mambo. I am a lawyer, a writer, and a speaker. And in my day role at Microsoft, I investigate workplace issues, amongst which include sexual harassment allegations. And so today I'm really passionate about being here and sharing my views on domestic violence. And I just want to be clear that the views I share today are not Microsoft's views, but mine only. And the way we'll run today's session is we'll each have a piece that we'll share, myself, Natalia, and Anita, and then we'll go into a conversation among the three of us in a panel-like setting, and then we'll turn it over to Aisha for Q&A. So without further ado, I'll invite Anita to introduce yourself.
I have to remember to unmute as well. Thank you guys so much for having me here. It is such an intense but deeply required subject to be speaking about, and I can literally kind of feel that electricity through this entire morning. So I just want to take a moment to ask each of us to just sort of, give ourselves this moment to just settle ourselves down a little bit, just for a few seconds, and just kind of come together because that's what we're doing here. We're actually coming together to discuss deeply and have real solutions and real actions. I want to thank United Women's Singapore for having me here with Natalia and Abam, for letting me share my views. I wish to contribute my voice and my platform and reach to bring awareness to everyone, bringing family violence front and center, opening and deepening conversations and actions, and removing it from the shadows into healing. And of course, my greatest wish is for the eradication of family and all violence. Let's not make domestic violence awareness another KPI, a CSR campaign, or another hashtag. Family violence really isn't new. It was always there. It does not stand alone either. There are intersections that definitely need examining. I think it's now just become painfully more obvious, obviously through the extreme circumstances of being homebound through COVID-19, one in which ironically emerged the exact kinds of pressures, fears, and mental health crisis that survivors and offenders experience daily. You know, we did not have before the emergence of all the studies, the facts and the figures, we did not always get to see this in any sort of public coverage or in the mainstream media before. As mentioned earlier, that Aisha mentioned, the Singapore Police Force revealed for the first time in their history of law enforcement figures for family violence offences in Singapore in 2020, which were in the number of 5,135 cases. A minister was quoted also as saying that the increase was expected as people spent longer hours at home. The word expected really landed with me, and I think it certainly deserves to be unpacked. I also want to take a moment to mention the violence against the women victims in Atlanta in the US. That is the intersection of xenophobia, misogyny, and as the shooter has been reported to have admitted, a likely hatred of sex workers. But I think it was also the seemingly docile actions of law enforcement in arresting the shooter, the words and terms being used, the name of the shooter before the victims, the sudden blurred vision of the media, all of this contributes actually to furthering the violence. I think these points also to deeply ingrained habits of attitudes towards women, the Asian diaspora. This is equally prevalent in Asia. Gaslighting techniques, conscious or unconscious, that soften brutality as if we are suddenly playing a game of hush. I think it's time for us to ground ourselves in reality. We cannot afford to avoid this. I think if we as individuals and companies really care about helping anyone who is experiencing any form of violence, if we are really interested in being educated on what to understand, look for, and stop, I would respectfully and perhaps controversially begin by suggesting that we reconsider the word abuse. Words are powerful. When we place domestic, elder, migrant alongside abuse, I strongly believe that it creates a misunderstanding of the gravity of the occurrence or turns it into a private shame or spousal family matter instead of a community and a country matter. I think we struggle with shame in this country and across Asia. And as we found out, we're struggling with shame across the world. Shame is a powerful state of fear. It is the same thing that stops a survivor from stepping out of circumstances and the same thing that often results in abuse. Everyone is forced or being forced into alliance with secrecy. Survivors are not allowed to speak of their experience by offenders. Threatened into submission, support can seem futile if not easily, readily, and dynamically available. The survivor's experiences begin to fade from reality. Family violence, I'm just going to say those words and let them land, feels the most appropriate overarching terminology to use in all outreach. The word violence has the rightful impact that we need to deliver, under which physical, sexual, emotional, and psychological abuse sit. And of course, this is not just prevalent only in family. Physical violence, sexual violence, emotional violence, psychological violence must be used as often as possible to describe, to explain, and to equip everyone with a deeper, more visceral understanding, which serves to inform and shake us out of accepting violence or of the disbelief that it even exists. The word violence moves us away from apathy or lack of understanding or awareness and describes the act in a way that we cannot or should not look away from. It certainly is a very, very hard truth. Accepting that violence exists in our society, that family violence is physical, sexual, emotional, and psychological, and what we must do about it is part of educating and harnessing society into willing action. That we must make better aware ourselves and everyone we know through understanding, outreach, language, and policy what physical, sexual, emotional, and psychological violence feels, looks, and sounds like, who it affects, anyone, and who could be an offender and why, without either stigmatizing the survivor or making assumptions on who the survivor can and cannot be. This is extremely urgent. In the workplace, we have to be certain that there is investment in the obvious, but also in the nuances of violence. Holistically designing via your policies and your spaces to be violence-free, dignity-oriented, zero-tolerant, that bullying and microaggression are included in violence, as well as making available non-judgmental, neutral, and if needed, anonymous access to the services, emergency codes, and considered policies that can assist any abuse survivor grappling with the terror that they face at home. Alongside this, as people, as human beings, we must acknowledge and deep dive into what creates abuse, what creates an offender, what survivors require, and what offenders require. Educating ourselves on the impact of stress, physical and social environment, childhood trauma, non-rigorous policy making, and an era of now non-accountability. This too is the work of companies. We also need to understand what rage is, what leads to rage, what companies are allowing to masquerade as drive so that survivors are safe in the sanctuary, in fact, of zero tolerance at all levels, and abusers are stopped, removed from causing further harm, but also have the option of rehabilitation. In legislation and law enforcement, we should not be at a public information level of grappling with whether violence is real, whether it's a private matter, whether someone is telling the truth or not, or what harmful behavior is, nor should our policies or law enforcement reflect this. There must be due diligence in all areas. I want to be clear. Domestic violence is largely towards women, but it is not only towards women. And I want to be further clear that violence isn't only disbelieved by men. Women too disbelieve other women, as much as men are made fun of if they are the survivor, as much as a trans person is thought to deserve it, as much as a child is thought to be receiving discipline. A migrant worker needs to be kept in their place. An elder is expected to take it because they are being cared for. As much as the UW study shows, shouting and yelling is not considered abusive. It's not violent. There are multiple layers, perceptions, and practices to unpack. But if we really want to address violence, we need to think deep and hard with empathy and courage about our country and what is driving us as human beings towards inflicting violence, and how companies are going to step up and invest effort, time, and money to intervene and play their part in helping to circumvent this crisis. Thank you. Back to you, Abam.
Thank you, Anita, and my sincere apologies. Sometimes we plan and then life happens. And so I had to switch computers in the middle of all this. But I caught everything, Anita, that you said. And I'm so glad that you brought your perspective, your platform, and your advocacy to this subject, because we do really need it. And so I will ask Natalia to introduce herself before I share my spiel here. Natalia, would you please tell the audience a little bit about who you are and the work that you do in this space?
Thanks, Abam. Hi, everybody, and thanks for having me as part of this really important conversation. My name's Natalia Rachel. I'm the director of Soma Clinic here in Singapore. I'm a trauma therapist and educator and consultant and speaker, and I'll look forward to sharing a bit more with you about the way I view this topic after Abam shares a little bit more. Thanks, Abam.
Absolutely. So from my perspective, domestic violence is something that I saw growing up. And I just wanted to take a pause and talk about how we got to be where we are right now. In February 2020, as the coronavirus spread and made its way across the world, we were confronted with something we have never seen before. And I think my video is not showing. There it is. Okay, thank you. So In February 2020, as the virus spread and made its way across the world, we were confronted with something we've never seen before. During those first few months, between December and March, we saw the workplace crash right into home. And everywhere you looked for hundreds of millions of people, if you looked in the bedroom, there was work. If you looked in the kitchen, there was work. If you checked in the closet, there too was work. And if you are one of the lucky few in the world to have a dining table, when you looked there, there was school. So all of a sudden, we're all piled on top of each other as a family in a way that we have not seen in recent history. All of a sudden, 24/7, we're together, all day, all night. What that did then was create problems in homes that didn't exist before. But also, it brought to the surface problems that had in fact been hidden for a long time, and domestic violence falls in the latter category. So, thanks to COVID-19, in a lot of ways, employers, especially conscientious ethical employers, can no longer pretend that domestic violence is not a thing that they care about. Because the moment when home and office hit, we can no longer pretend that it's not our problem, whether we are colleagues or HR or business leaders. I don't say that to say domestic violence did not exist before COVID-19. It's always been there, but it's been hidden very well by most of us, whether because we're the abuser, the victim, or quite frankly, bystanders. And we'll talk a little bit about what each of these categories mean. So in the aftermath of all of this, we're left asking the question, what is the role of the employer when it comes to domestic violence? And for me, I try to keep it quite simple. I think first and foremost that employers have a responsibility to prevent domestic violence and to protect victims of domestic violence, primarily because it's an issue of human rights first and foremost. If we're going to talk about preventing things like child labor, child trafficking, if we're going to talk about equal work for equal pay, if we're going to talk about inclusion and diversity, by God, inclusion has to mean protecting victims of domestic violence, whether they're in the workplace or at home. And in some ways, in my personal view, that responsibility is heightened when we're now asking employees to work from home, which for many victims, home may actually not be succor. For many domestic violence victims, they go to work to get away from home. So employers cannot turn away their responsibility in this space. But what can they do? One of the questions I get a lot as an employment lawyer is, well, we're not law enforcement, we're not social workers, right? It's not our job. These are personal matters. We're not law enforcement officers. So what is indeed the role of employers? I'll share a few views on that. I mentioned earlier that the reason companies should care foremost is because we're talking about human beings and human rights. But the other reason employers must care about this issue is because we cannot talk with a straight face about employee safety, health, and well-being while ignoring domestic violence. It just doesn't add up. But the third reason is productivity. The workplace is, after all, a microcosm of the larger society. We don't stop being who we are when we get to work, no matter what anybody says, which means the traumas that victims endure, the pain on a mental, physiological, psychological level that they experience being victims of domestic violence at home, don't get shed when they reach the workplace. So it's important that we pay attention, whether we are leaders in the workplace or HR or colleagues, to what's happening to domestic violence, to victims among us. Having said why employers should actually care, what can employers do? The first thing is to simply acknowledge that domestic violence is an issue. We have seen that when companies take a stand on an issue, This is a ripple effect. As we look at some of the world's largest companies like Apple and Microsoft, in fact, the FANGs, and how much they're worth in revenue, they have a huge voice on the global stage. When companies like them, all the way through the mom and pop stores, start to recognize that domestic violence is an issue, we start to gain traction. So first things first, what employers must do is acknowledge domestic violence is in fact an issue. Next step is partnering with law enforcement, legal, HR, medical, to better understand what domestic violence actually is in order to create a program around domestic violence. Because the reality is, we all go to work, we're not experts. I may have practiced law for 14 years, but I'm not an expert in domestic violence. So employers should work with those who understand it better to create a program in the workplace that educates and trains employees around what what domestic violence actually is. Beyond the program, companies need to have clear-cut policies that address the issue head-on. Most companies now focus quite clearly on sexual harassment. And I bring these two things together because we're talking about violence, right? They're not so different. So a policy which clearly delineates what domestic violence looks like, what it feels like, and what employees can do to support each other is a critical part of any program an employer puts into place. Finally, employers need to have resources available to victims of domestic violence. Some companies have employee assistance programs which allow for employees to visit the doctor, get therapy, or actually just talk to a lawyer if need be, but not all. We encourage employers who don't have these programs to liaise with community centers that do have these programs to support employees who are victims of domestic violence. So what we're asking is not such a stretch, because in so many ways, as someone who investigates in this space, the resources are there for things like sexual harassment. It's not so much to ask employers to stretch a little bit further to accommodate and to highlight issues facing victims of domestic violence. Finally, there's a huge stigma attached to domestic violence. When employers are silent on this issue, they unwittingly exacerbate the stigma. We understand very well that victims of domestic violence, like victims in other areas, don't want to bring these issues into the work arena. However, companies cannot be complicit in perpetuating this stigma. So training, programs, as well as policies send a message to victims that companies do care about your well-being. And so talking about it makes it easier for people to associate with it and to raise their hands to say, I need help. For many victims, that statement, I need help, may be the first step towards recovery. Thank you. And now I'll pass it on to Natalia to share her perspectives on what companies should be doing. Natalia? You're on mute.
Yes. Thank you, Abam. As someone who works with victims of domestic violence and abuse day in, day out, I'm really grateful to join this conversation. Domestic abuse, as both Abam and Anita have said, has always been an issue, but it's becoming more visible as we shift our focus and knowledge to not only mental health, but to the inextricable nature of the work self and the personal self. In fact, we're just one and the same, we're human. Did you know that according to a recent study by Ipsos and UWS, 40% of Singaporeans think that abuse is not prevalent in Singapore? Yet, at my clinic, we see this every single day. In the last 12 months, Soma Clinic has started to receive a flurry of requests from people reaching out and saying, I need help, I'm not coping, I'm anxious and afraid, and I don't know what to do. When we ask them to complete a new client questionnaire, do you know the one thing that these people have in common, these new clients? an experience of abuse. Either it's something that's going on right now, or it's something that's happened in the past, but it's still affecting them right now. The essence of how we treat clients in a one-on-one therapeutic interaction can be harnessed and adapted to curate systems and policies for corporates and communities. It's all about safety, boundaries, invitation to express, and the sanctity of relationships. This is trauma-informed care. In the next 10 minutes, I'd like to bring awareness to 3 main talking points. Firstly, I'm going to talk about a few definitions in this subject, and then I'll be sharing the experience of somebody that has been abused. And lastly, I'll touch on a relational approach to trauma recovery, which is exactly what myself and Soma Clinic are all about. So let's get into the definitions. Abuse causes trauma. Let's define these 2 really important words. Both abuse and trauma exist on a spectrum. In essence, trauma is when a past experience of threat is living and breathing in us now. The threatening experience is over, but the body believes that the threat is still present, and the physiological response also has mental, emotional, and relational effects. Abuse occurs when a person's physical, mental, or emotional sovereignty is denied, a personal boundary has been violated, and harm is experienced. The reason abuse is very hard to define is because an individual's personal boundaries are very unique. What is acceptable or welcome for some is completely unacceptable for another. A bigger issue when it comes to abuse is that many victims are unaware of their right to sovereignty and do not have the agency required to set and maintain boundaries. The same study that I quoted earlier shows that 1 in 4 people do not consider hitting a spouse as domestic abuse. 62% do not consider threats like slamming doors and banging tables abuse. 49% do not consider yelling or verbal threats as abuse. And 47% do not consider psychological abuse, where there is control asserted over actions and words, as abuse. As a nation, our perception of what is okay and acceptable is severely miscalibrated. This is a systemic problem. It makes potential victims powerless to the abuser even before the abuse begins. In the case of domestic abuse, there's often a lead-up period to the full-blown abuse, a series of boundary breaches that weaken and disempower the victim. And based on these stats I've just shared, most of them have no idea that anything untoward is going on. There's 2 key conversation points here. Firstly, how do we educate potential victims, which, as both Anita and Abam mentioned, could be anyone, on sovereignty and boundaries? You know, anybody can fall victim to abuse. At our clinic, we see executives, CEOs, and even celebrities all going through the same thing. In addition, how do we build a system that invites these people to seek support when boundaries are violated? And the second conversation point is, how do we engage with the abusers? These people have no respect for personal boundaries, either from a lack of empathy or from uncontrollable emotions, mainly rage, that often stem from their own trauma. And here, trauma begets trauma. So in order to help the victims, we also need to work with the abusers to set boundaries and promote rehabilitation. The abusers are at work too, sitting amongst us. When someone has had their basic human rights violated, they experience an existential shift. And this existential component is something I'm very passionate about educating on. When this happens, the world is no longer a safe place. The body is no longer a safe haven. People are a potential source of harm. And this completely changes their experience of the world and the way they're able to relate to each other. In the workplace, this can translate to employees who are feeling constantly threatened and worried and silent, and perhaps they're not able to focus and carry out their daily workload with ease. Or on the other hand, they could present as defensive, aggressive, and non-compliant, and these people are usually labeled toxic employee, with little understanding of what's going on inside them. Each person's manifestation will be unique, depending on a series of adaptive survival responses that pertain to the nature and the duration of the abuse, because remember, it's a spectrum, their early life attachment dynamics, and also the presence or lack of supportive relationships and emotional intimacy available to them. Often accompanying this existential shift that goes with abuse is a shameful and confused silence. There's a feeling of, what is wrong with me? Why can't I just be normal? Why am I like this? The question here is, how do we spot that someone is or has experienced abuse, and what can workplaces do about it? Now, not everybody is a therapist like me, ready to hold space for trauma, and nor should they be. But there is a very big gap to be addressed. Most victims do not seek care, either because they can't afford it, they don't think it's an option, or some feel that they don't deserve it. They stay silent and alone with their abuse story. Now, just advocating the message, reach out, like I need help, let us know, it's not enough. These people need us to notice them and to reach in. When I train therapists to work in our clinic, one of the subjects I teach is how to spot signs of threat and abuse. We can look at behaviors, language, expression, and body language, and we can also look at physiological markers. There is a pretty straightforward checklist. We're being given clues all the time. So why are we not doing the same education at work? This is another way to learn active listening. And until we really listen to the unsaid, how are we going to know who needs help? In my opinion, this isn't so much about corporate responsibility. This is about being human, about not turning a blind eye as a bystander. I mean, what would you do if you knew your colleague was being abused? Would you speak up? Why or why not? This is all about how we relate to each other. In my work as a trauma therapist, it's actually the relationship, the safe relationship between me and my clients that is the crucible for recovery. Abuse occurs within a harmful relationship dynamic, so it makes sense that relationship can also be harnessed as a powerful means to recovery and reclamation. If we were to bring this concept to the workplace, what would it look like? What constitutes a safe relationship with your employer, with your manager, with your colleagues? To me, on a very basic level, a safe place constitutes two main things. Firstly, no harm may be done. And secondly, authentic and vulnerable expression is welcome. When it comes to workplace safety, the latter is much harder to cultivate. It's a question of culture, and this is something I work with very closely, trauma-informed culture building. Domestic abuse affects all of us. As Abam said, we're either the abused, the abuser, or the bystander. The workplace is a microculture, a slice of humanity. Sure, we can say that if we help the abused, they'll perform better at work and profits will rise. But actually, I think that's a little bit perverse. If we actually start allowing humans the right to their sovereignty, they're going to thrive as individuals and within a culture. This is about systemic change. Thank you so much. Abam, I'll pass back to you.
Natalia, thank you so much. Your passion for your work just shines right through, and I'm just so honored to be sharing this panel with you and Anita, because I know all three of us have that passion, and you both using your platforms to share this message. We do have a few questions from the audience, but I have some I prepared for both of you, because I'm really keenly interested in continuing the dialogue. And so there were some things that you touched on, both of you, that I want to just kind of dig a little bit deeper into. Natalia, I'll start with you. You talked about just now boundary breaches. Can you just give a few examples of what that means for the audience to understand? When we talk boundary breaches, what does that look like?
Thanks, Anita. Abam. Abam. Boundary breaches is a really interesting topic. And here we're talking about what's happening at home, so domestic abuse. So we have many different layers of boundaries. The most obvious one is a physical boundary. So if somebody touches us in any way where touch is not welcome, that is breaching a physical boundary. And that actually doesn't even have to be physical violence. That can be unwanted touch. And another boundary is an emotional boundary. So when someone that we're in a relationship denies our right to have an emotion or tells us that it's not real or not true, an emotional boundary is breached, and this borders more into psychological abuse. And then there is also mental boundaries, where the person we're in a relationship does not allow us to voice our opinion on something, so we're not really allowed a voice. So they would be the three main kinds of boundaries. And I mean, as I mentioned in my little session, everything is a spectrum. So sometimes, I mean, we're all breaching each other's boundaries every day in small ways, but when abuse is occurring, there are big ways, and it usually happens over time, that there's these series of breaches, and the person being abused knows, actually, I don't have a right to exist in a certain way anymore. So they start packing away parts of their experience just in order to engage in the relationship at all. And it's not a conscious thing, it's a survival adaptation.
Thank you for that, because one of the things I want to make sure that our guests hear from today is not just the theory of domestic violence, but what it actually is, like to be able to identify what it looks like. And so I just wanted to go back to that, because when you said boundary breaches, I'm a writer, so I like the rhyming, and I'm like, boundary breaches, that just stuck in my head. And I wanted to make sure that everyone understands what that means. So Anita, I'll just come to you. We've talked about the role of employers in in supporting domestic violence victims. And I know you're passionate about how we frame this conversation. When you began today, you said this is not another KPI. So can you share what you think, how you think organizations should actually be framing this conversation in the workplace?
Thank you, Abam. And Natalia, as always, I always feel so much of your not just your passion and your energy, but your knowledge. And I have to say that I just want to answer something that Natalia was talking about, and then go to framing it for a company. Because as somebody who's actually experienced persistent unwanted harassment twice in my life, persistent boundary breaches, I can attest to the impact, the fear, and the apathy. And what actually happens quite often to the person who's being victimized is that you just get caught. And it's quite hard to actually articulate exactly what a boundary breach is. And I'm so glad that that's what you've done today, because when you're in it, you don't actually understand what is happening. It's a very confusing state of affairs. It impacts the way that you operate in the world. It impacts your sleep, because you're too afraid to sleep because you never know when the boundary is going to be breached. And it's a state of being that is extremely impactful. So yeah, I just wanted to add my few cents worth and my personal experience with that, actually. So what can companies do? I mean, I think we've talked a little bit about this in both of our speeches today, but the first thing I would say is that evaluate life with conscience. Natalia brought it up earlier, and we share the same, and I know that you share the same, Abam, and I'm sure everybody who's listening in, is that what 2020 has taught us is that there is really no separation. We're all together in this, and there's no work-life balance. There's work balance and life balance, and that's what we need to be aiming for. So let's evaluate life with true and deep conscience. Gallup has just revealed actually a wellness report out. It's titled The Wellbeing Engagement Paradox of 2020. I mean, I don't know what the paradox is, but it is largely America oriented, but it's honestly a kind of a global report. And we all share the same worry, the same stress, and the same impact of the worry and the stress. I would say a company must also assess the mental wellness of the organization first. Goldman Sachs, anybody? Not the engagement of employees, because engagement can often be stress-driven. This particular report from Gallup talked about how engagement went up really, really high. Well, stress can drive your engagement too. So let's not look at engagement as a source of how well people are. You need to evaluate the wellness of the actual company. Evaluate leadership. I attend and I speak and I do a lot of webinars with leaders, and or people want to hold conferences and sessions for employees, and I always ask this question: will all the top management be there? Because there's no point in evaluating your management when you're not daring to evaluate your leadership. And what sort of trickle down or avalanche effect is there, both good and not good, both positive and negative? And I would say ask the employees. Quite often we're quite happy to have a holding pattern. Ask employees, they'll tell you what they really think if you ask them. Evaluate authority principles and practices in a company. Ask employees once again, you need to deep dive into whether does harassment, aggression, bullying, racism, does this exist? These are all forms of violence. And that's what I talked about, the intersection, because you can't separate everything out. There's always a lot of other factors that bring these things together as well. And I think we need to redefine what well-being is. A lot of companies have a lot of things in place. What does well-being mean now that we have been brought to our very, very acute attention what well-being actually isn't? So we need to include family violence. We need to include mental health. We need to include time away and not stigmatize it. I want to talk about also mental health days. I know in Australia, you can take a mental health day, and I think this is a really beautiful practice. And it's something that companies can think about, because once you remove the stigma, if someone's taking a mental health day, you should be happy they're taking a mental health day, not like, whoa, what the hell's wrong with you? This is a practice I think we could really afford to inculcate in Singapore, because anyway, people are taking medical leave. So if you ask me, quite often, if on Monday morning you're taking medical leave, that probably might count as a mental health day. It's difficult perhaps to come back to work, to face work. We don't know what's happening. And it allows people to have that sovereignty. And I love that word, that you can actually take this, it's available to you, and you can use it for what you need. Space is a really big thing for me. And I mean physical space. What does it mean? We saw last year, it means completely different things. People spent the first 6 months of the year posing in the pajamas at home on Instagram, but a lot of other people couldn't have that opportunity, didn't have that space. But in a work environment, who needs to work at the office? Who needs to work at home? Believe them. Okay. How do you find out without embarrassing an employee who may be in a violent situation? What are the terms that you use? What is the way that you seek to find out? You need someone like Natalia to come in and train people, because we can all fall into the gaps, right? We can all fall into the practice of not actually speaking speaking the right way, holding the right language, right? What language do you use actually in a company? Is it a very patriarchal, very sort of sexist language that are you even aware of what you speak about, how you speak? How do you speak to women? How do you speak to men? How do you speak to LGBTQI? How do you speak as human beings? Sometimes I think I get really worked up, because do we really need to be told how to speak to one another? But we do, because we are developing our personalities online and offline, and there's a lot of mix in the way that we're speaking, and companies also might pride themselves on having great communication, but let's get down to the words. Now, Abam, you're a writer, words have great meaning and great authority, and it's how they land as well. So that's pretty much what I would say. I would say that if every company in Singapore and every company everywhere that really wants to be a holistic space began a practice of mental health days, normalize that need, I think it would help a lot of people. It doesn't mean that it's going to actually stop violence, but it could be those days that people can actually use to go to therapy, to go to places that they need to go, to find out where they can get safety. Because a lot of people who are in violent situations, they're scared most of the time. And perhaps the places, as we've said, they feel safe, where they can make their inquiries without the hypervigilance or being watched or being seen, can actually happen on those days or in the office.
Thanks, Anita. Very comprehensive response. Really, really liked that. Whenever I hear people talk, I usually take notes, because there's things I want to actually take away with me. And there's something you said, and I hope I got it exactly right. Evaluate life with conscience. Is that what you said? That needs to be on a board somewhere. Evaluate life with conscience. And the power in that for me is, it goes back to what we talked about earlier around, it's not about KPIs, it's not just about the bottom line, we're talking about human beings. And because we're talking about human beings, there has to be a space for conscience. There has to be a space where we're connecting on a human level beyond the worker, beyond the employee. So thank you for gifting us that very powerful line there. One of the questions that has come through for me is, what are key failures or opportunities for improvements in most corporate policies? I think that one of the first areas of which is a failure is just the complete absence of conversations or policies or programs around domestic violence. So before I have anything to critique, there needs to be something in place. And I think that's the gap, is that a lot of employers view this as a personal issue, as a home issue, and therefore it's not the arena of the employer and they need not do anything. But like I said, we are not chameleons, right? In the sense that who we are at home will show up in work in one way or another. And to the extent that we do have workplace violence, actually, right? And some of that workplace violence is a result of domestic violence. We have had situations where domestic violence has spilled into the workplace physically, right? So I think one of the biggest gaps is these conversations are not happening in the way that they should. There aren't programs in place, there aren't policies in place. And what some employers do is kind of stand or hide behind, it's a private matter. It can be a private matter. It cannot be a private matter. We're talking about your employee, right? We talk about things like, days off to take care of your child. We collect information from our employees about their health, right? So those are personal things that kind of enter the workplace. This is no different. So for me, that's the biggest gap, is just the absence of these programs. And where these programs do exist, what I'd like to see improve is a conversation in a very real way as we do inclusion and diversity. And I keep going back to inclusion and diversity because this is an important issue. Again, we know domestic violence predominantly affects women. How do we have a conversation about equal pay and equity and all of that without ensuring that the mental, physical, and physiological well-being of women workers is paramount? We cannot divorce those things. So there needs to be a part of the conversation around inclusion and diversity that focuses on workplace violence, on home violence that spills into the workplace. And now that we have this marriage of work and home, it's even exacerbated. But I do want to add something, and Anita, thank you for calling me out on this last week. And it's a reminder that, yes, now many of us are working from home, and it has brought this issue to the fore for employers. And so in the next few months, maybe next year, we might all go back to a physical workplace, we might not. That doesn't mean we need to go back to pretending that this issue doesn't exist. It does. This is our new normal. So one of the things that I would say we need to be better at is being proactive in this space. Because of COVID, we were reactive. We were responding to what was happening. We know better now. When this time comes and goes, we have the awareness, we have the tools to ensure that we are actually protecting victims of domestic violence in the workplace. So in a nutshell, that's what I think employers can do a lot better than we're doing now. And I'll shift to more questions for Natalia and Anita, and either of you can take this first one. So we talked earlier about, and I mentioned, we're all on a spectrum here when it comes to domestic violence. You're either the abused, the abuser, or a bystander. And I know that's a pretty controversial statement to make because most of us like to think that we have nothing to do with domestic violence. So let me start by asking, who is a victim of domestic abuse? Natalia, I don't know if you want to take that one. We have a lot of assumptions about who it is: less privileged people, poor people, and so on. But what is the profile of a domestic violence victim, Natalia?
Thanks, Abam. That's a really good question with not a clear answer. Anybody can be a victim of domestic abuse or violence. So at our clinic, there are many different profiles that are coming in, and they're often not what you would think. So you would think, oh, it's somebody that's a bit weak or can't connect to their power, and it's just not true. There are so many type A career women who are kicking ass at work, excuse my language, and at home they're being severely abused. There are men that are CEOs and executives, and at home they have partners who are yelling at them or even hitting them. There are celebrities who it looks like they have the best life in the world and they're going home every night and crying and terrified what's going on. So there really isn't a clear, one profile, but the marker is that when somebody has lost their sovereignty and when they've lost their sense of agency and impulse to set those boundaries that we were talking about later. So that's the common theme. Within a relational dynamic, I am disempowered, I'm not able to set a boundary, I'm not able to transform the dynamic, and I'm not able to leave. I hope that answers.
Thank you. Anita, do you have a perspective on that? And while you're at it, I know you had touched on who is a potential abuser or who is an abuser. So if you can answer that first question and then lead into abuser, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I think that I'll speak from a Singapore perspective because I have so many of these conversations locally, and the disbelief that we have comes from a lot of shame, I think, because when we talk about violence or abuse or whatever, no one really wants to believe that it actually happens. I think also we don't have enough information around why it happens. And there's a lot to be talked about, a lot to be unpacked why abuse happens. It doesn't just spontaneously or sporadically happen, right? But I find that in Singapore quite often there is this division that we make between the haves and the have-nots. And a person who's being abused necessarily falls along the line of you're probably also poor, or you have too many children, or you made bad choices in life, and I find all of these extremely troubling. It's the same thing it's the same attitude we have towards education. The more higher educated you are, surely your life is also highly educated. But these things are not, they don't intersection, and I think we need to really watch ourselves, because what happens here is that we deny ourselves the opportunity to look more widely and to look at the fact that abuse isn't something that just happens to a person because of their stature in life or lack of stature in life. Abuse doesn't happen just because you have more or less money. I did an interview last year, and I was actually quite shocked because the person running this organization was making these assumptions that, well, you know how it is, with poor people. I was like, no, I don't actually, because what the hell are you saying, actually? And it was quite shocking, but it gave me a lot of information about the way that we perceive who is a person who needs it. And what I said in my 10 minutes earlier, I also noticed, and you can see it from the evidence in that's been collected, right? What is abusive or violent behavior? I think that words are extremely violent. They can be very violent, but another person believes that the words that you yell at your helper because she didn't do something right, you deny your migrant worker the rights. All of this is a form of violence, and we need to stop actually sectionalizing things and intersectionaling them. And I also want to add to that I think that bigotry and racism are woven into these conversations quite often. It's not just about whether you have the means, but what's your skin color and what's your religion and all of these things. There's a lot to unpack. We don't have enough time, but yeah, that's those are the things. If you're going to evaluate consciously, evaluate your perceptions and evaluate your privilege as a human being and as an organization.
What's so powerful about that, especially the last part you said, is you tied it back to really big issues that everyone is focused on now, right? The color of your skin and race and religion. And somehow we don't make the connection. These are all different forms of violence, right? And that's why I keep going back to, as we continue to talk about inclusion and diversity, this needs to be part of that conversation, because again, we're talking about marginalized communities. Victims of domestic violence are part of a marginalized community, and we need to treat it as such. One of the things that came to mind as we were all talking, ladies, is that we haven't talked about children. And I just wanted to bring that up because I think for parents, for working parents, this is an issue, right? So when we're talking about children who are in abusive situations, if one parent is abusing a child and the other parent has to kind of deal with it, this is also an issue that creates mental stress. So I mentioned that kind of in passing because that's not the focus of this conversation, but I mentioned it because I think it's directly relevant. In the same way that we take time off to care for our physically ill children, I think employers need to give people time off to care for their children who are victims of domestic violence. It's not something that we talk about a lot, but I wanted to highlight that because in some ways, I find it's quite strange that these things are treated as very separate issues, but they're really not, right? They're really not. So I just wanted to take 2 seconds or 5 seconds, whatever it was, to bring up that point. Anita, you seem to have something to say.
Yeah, I think that in addition to that, we also need to think about caregiving for elders. Also, that's a big, topic of concern for me, because I think a lot of people are afraid to actually say that they need to take time off to go care for an elder. And elder abuse is also on the rise here in Singapore. The frustration, the dynamic, everything it's the same thing going on. And if an organization doesn't have that sort of holistic understanding of what real life is, if you really just only believe that life is this 8 or 9 or 10 hours in the office, then you really need to have a big reevaluation.
And Natalia, coming back to you, you touched on this a little bit, but like I said, this session, if there's one thing I want people to really take away from this is understanding what it actually means to be a victim of domestic violence. So I know that, you talked earlier about victims coming from different backgrounds, looking different, there could be CEOs, but on the inside, in the psyche, in the spirit, in the body of an abused victim, can you give us a sense of what's really going on there?
Absolutely. Thanks, Abam. I think this is really important, and this piece is required for everything else to stem from it, because how can we really support someone if we don't understand what's happening to them or how to recognize what's happening beneath the surface? So there's a lot going on internally, psychologically, with someone who's going through or has gone through abuse. So there are a few key things that are internal, which I'll share. The first, which has been touched on a bit by Anita, is the experience of shame. So the thoughts that go along with the shame are, how could I have let this happen to me? Did I do something to deserve it? I must be a terrible person, or I'm just so weak. And that actually starts to breed self-hatred. And shame causes silence. So when we experience shame, we don't speak up. And that's why what I mentioned before about reaching in is really required. When we are experiencing shame, we're not going to breathe a word about it. The second thing that is always available or relevant to someone that's being abused is a sense of fear. And the fear could have many layers to it. So one of the thoughts might be, if I speak up, will the abuse get worse? And the chances are probably it will, unfortunately. Or it might be, if I speak up, will I lose my financial security, or will I be abandoned or rejected by my relationship? And it kind of seems a bit strange to care about losing a relationship in which you're experiencing harm, but this is one of the markers of psychological abuse. So the victim is trapped and they're powerless, and it feels like there's no way out. So they're literally petrified. And in a practical sense, many people are being abused by somebody that they rely on. So whether it's they're relying on the financial security or relational security. So there's a feeling that I can't survive without this person in my life, even though they're harming me. And that's one of the paradoxes of trauma. And it goes back to early life attachment wounds. And the third thing that happens when there is abuse is a loss of reality. So usually there's experiences of gaslighting, projection, there can be threats, and just this repeated harm that really weakens and erodes the spirit. And the person being abused can think, am I really being abused? Is this true? Did I cause the abuse? Am I the abuser? So there's this inability to know what is real and what is not. And this causes them to freeze and again, shut down. And when this experience happens, what we have to do as someone being abused is we've got to survive. So what we do is we snap on, I call it the external shell, and it's a personality that can cope and get through life while this awful, threatening experience is going on. And our external shells are different for everyone. They're unique and they depend on a lot of other things. What are our go-to adaptive survival responses? And what else is going on in our life now, and what else has gone on in our life before? And there are three main things to look out for in the workplace to identify that these shells are in play. So I'll kind of split them into three possible presentations. So the first would be the burnout effect. So this person is so exhausted and depleted from being repeatedly abused that they cannot focus at work, they cannot get their work done, they're exhausted, and they may even start presenting physical conditions like autoimmune conditions or chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia or constantly like a runny nose and a sore throat. They're really not managing. The second, and this one's really easy to spot, you know something's up. The second archetype or presentation that pops up, I call it the Jekyll and Hyde switch flip. And this person is totally fine 1 minute. You might be in a meeting or having a conversation or engagement and everything's fine. And then all of a sudden, bam, they are exploding and they're angry or they're crying or they're not talking to you anymore. And it's like night and day. And what's happened with this person is that they've snapped on their external shell, but they can't maintain it. So something, and it's usually another colleague or a pressure of having to achieve, it triggers the suppressed experience or abuse. So when there's abuse, there will be suppressed experiences of anger, of grief, of confusion, all of these things that are being triggered by what's around them. And these people are the ones that are commonly labeled toxic employee. I really dislike that term. I think it's being thrown around as a buzzword right now, but people are toxic because they're not coping, and abuse might be one of the reasons that they're not coping. And the third presentation, which is the most difficult to spot, are those that are experts at hiding. And so these people will commonly present as type A people who are superstars at work, smile on their faces, overachieving, and you're like, wow, how do they do so many things in a day? It's like they've got 80 hours in a day. And often this person is covering for something that's going on beneath. They're overcompensating. And the thing with this one is that actually it's the most dangerous because the nervous system and the psyche are working overtime and overtime to almost exist in two different ways at once. And it can lead to both mental and physical health concerns later on. And the really interesting thing is that for many of these people, these responses are completely unconscious and they haven't linked the way that they are existing now with the abuse experience. And that can be confusing and it can elicit yet another layer of shame and another layer of shutting down. So I think, you know, a lot of work in this field needs to be around understanding this and educating at various layers with different levels of knowledge, how this can present. And then the next bit is what do you do about it? Thanks, Abam.
Wow, I learned a lot there. On the point of shame, so I grew up in Cameroon, which is in West Africa. And one of the things that was often said by a lot of people was, do not wash dirty laundry in public. So when we talk about shame, that's what Natalia is talking about, is this whole idea that how dare you let someone outside this house know what's going on inside this house. And that's one of the leading reasons why victims of domestic violence do not say anything. It's this, the shame is so deep and it's so profound. And for many people, it starts at an early age, hearing things like don't air a dirty laundry in public, that is hard to kind of tease that out. The one thing I do want to say is that in the workplace, you're not an expert. It's not your job to go digging out these people and trying to figure out what's going on with them. And in fact, I think people might feel like you're trespassing their boundaries. But I'm going to speak for Natalia for like 2 seconds. What I understand Natalia to be saying is when you see these symptoms, find the right person to talk to. That may be HR, that may be a line manager, because a lot of times when employees have this explosive behavior in the workplace or they're acting out of character, you want to be careful not to further trigger them, right? By spreading rumors, for example, which can lead to ostracism or anything else that may affect their performance. So we're highlighting this so that people know, one, for yourself, what might be going on with you if you're not yet aware that you might be a victim of domestic violence, or when you see it with others, to draw attention to it in an appropriate way without further triggering them. So I just wanted to, I didn't want anybody to leave here thinking we're placing a burden on you to go kind of digging. But that brings me into bystander effect, because we have to talk about that. We talked about victims, we've talked about abusers. Natalia or Anita, one of you can start. Who is a bystander?
Natalia, I think it would be great to have a clinical understanding actually of bystander, and then I will tell you a small story of the bystander effect.
Okay, sure. Again, I think this is a really tricky topic because technically a bystander is anybody who is watching or aware of an experience of abuse or of a boundary breach and does nothing. But that's all of us every single day. And so I think the question can shift not only to what is a bystander, but where is the line? Where is the line when we should no longer be a bystander and where we should insert ourselves into a dynamic? What is appropriate? And I think this is such a difficult conversation because, as a couple of us have mentioned before, personal boundaries are so unique. So some people, it might not be okay to raise a voice, whereas other people, sure, I can have a heated argument and I'm fine. So this is very personal, but I think what we can start to do is when we're dealing with workplace culture and communities in general, we can create almost manifestos that say in our culture, this is what is okay, and this here are the lines, or here's the spectrum where there is a line where action needs to be taken, and what are the appropriate actions and what are inappropriate. So Abam, as you mentioned, sometimes you might think that you're trying to help, or you might think you're trying to set a boundary, and it inflames the situation more. So it's very, very nuanced. Over to you, Anita, for your story.
Thank you so much. I just want to say that, you know, it's also really important to kind of know what you stand for, because in an environment, you know, an office environment or any environment really, because I really don't think that a corporate environment is any different from any other environment. It's still a kaleidoscope, it's still a microcosm, and we are still intersecting many, many different things. But know what you actually stand for. You know, I think we all know and understand what violence actually is. We do at a visceral human level. You know when something doesn't sound right. I think really the bystander effect comes from a little bit of the fright. You know, if we look in terms of flight, fright, fight, right? Quite often what it is it's our own response to either whether it's learned at childhood or along the way, to how you perceive what is actually happening. So, you know, a friend of mine actually witnessed a man beating a woman, and his immediate response was to step in. And when he stepped in, knowing and perceiving and understanding that there was a lot of violence, and the man turned to him and wanted to actually be violent towards him, it allowed the woman the woman who was the victim to actually escape. But what was really interesting was when he took this message home to his family, you know, one of his elders was like, "Why did you get involved? You know, why'd you get involved?" So each person is actually having a different kind of emotional reaction to when they see danger. You know, so you're either going to be a no, or you're going to step in. I'm the kind who always steps in because it's just this kind of feeling like I'm going to go in there and I don't know what's going to happen. I'm going to do it. So I think corporate or otherwise, you know, you have to know what you stand for. I stand for nonviolence, and if I see it happening, I don't care what the circumstances are. I will step in there. I will say something, and that is the human to human contact. Yes, of course, you know, you could be wrong, and I have been wrong, but I'm happy to be wrong. Then I'd rather not have missed an opportunity to help somebody. And a lot of people also believe that when you step in, you're only going to make it worse for the other person. Well, that just depends on how you step in and what are you willing to do for this situation. You know, the friend in this story was willing to speak to the police, and the police did their due diligence and actually caught up to the couple. So we have to also have that in us, that what we really want is to have for people to be safe. That is what you stand for, safety. I stand for nonviolent communication. I stand for lack of microaggression. I'm not standing in here trying to kind of defend myself or defend somebody else. I stand for this. I think that's really important.
Very well said. Very well said. I think we have about 5 more minutes and a few questions before we turn it back over to Aisha. So there's one here from me. What is one policy or practice which a company can adopt to check in with their employees if they're experiencing violence in their personal life? So if companies don't already have this, they should implement it. So many companies, as I'm aware, have a hotline. And this is just kind of baseline. If companies don't have it, it's worth having. And it's a hotline where employees can call anonymously to report that they need some kind of help. It could be workplace related. It could be, related to violence at home. I think what's important here in terms of checking is employers have to communicate to employees that it's okay to use those resources for domestic violence concerns, because the default assumption by employees is if it's a work hotline, it's only for stuff that relates to work. So I think employers need to be proactive in saying, we have this hotline. If you need it because you're being, beaten up at home or something like that, that they're able to use that. So I would say that's one way to do it. The pandemic has caused us to be quite creative, in terms of check-ins. One of the things I've seen work well in a number of organizations are team meetings where people just form their own kind of small groups, check-in groups on WhatsApp and whatever else, to just kind of check on each other. And I'm saying that at a more employee, colleague, co-worker level, right? And what I mean by that is companies can provide an infrastructure, but companies are run by people. There's a part of this that has to be our accountability to just check on each other, human to human, right? So I think on the one level, we do need to have these hotlines that people can call, but on another level, we're talking again about human beings, and we have an obligation to look out, bless you, Anita, to look out for each other and to just make sure that we're checking in through WhatsApp and all of that. So that's one way that I would say employers can actually protect victims of domestic violence. And there was one more for, I believe this was for you, Natalia. What does it look like when a company is trauma-informed, and how does that benefit domestic violence survivors?
Thanks, Abam. There are a lot of complex educational systems and policies and procedures that need to go in place for a workplace to truly say that it's trauma-informed. But I think that there are 3 key elements to this. First of all, is being aware of what is going on inside the employees, which we touched on a little bit just earlier. So how does it present? How can we notice it? That's number 1, awareness, what's happening. The next part is how can we help? And there are different layers. How can employees engage in the best way? What channels can we start to build out so that people can access help and feel safe enough to access help? So there's got to be a lot of work around healing the shame attached to it and destigmatization. And the third part is understanding what is re-traumatization. And re-traumatization is when the way we engage with somebody who's experienced trauma, and in this case abuse, actually triggers another trauma response. And this can be very, very damaging. So those are the 3 areas that corporates would need training on to understand and to build out education that would be different at different layers of the organizational structure. So all of these things need to be taken into account. And then I think in order to really make it integrated into people's life, there will be a need to work with partners both inside the organization but external, because there is a line, right? There's a line where an organization can support and take responsibility, but there's a line where they can't. But it doesn't mean that the person, the victim, is all sorted and it's over. They're going to likely need ongoing support if they're really going to recover and reclaim their sense of self and continue to be a good employee for your company or not. So working with, as Abam mentioned before, law enforcement or medical or therapists, creating groups is another great idea, which you just touched on. Group therapy is known to be highly, highly effective for people that have overcome or are overcoming trauma. So creating peer groups that are very well facilitated by a trauma-informed facilitator can also be a really big part of it. So there are all these pieces that need to be built out so that it actually becomes a culture shift. Thanks, Abam.
Thanks, Natalia. And for the last question, because we're going to now shift and go back to Aisha, just really quickly, one from Anita, one from Natalia. What are some ways you think co-workers can support victims of domestic violence? Just maybe one or two quick things, and then I'll go back to Aisha.
So the question was how co-workers can support victims of violence. I think when you know somebody is a victim of violence, there's a protocol, and when you don't know, there's a protocol as well. So the don't know is you don't know and you don't understand. It's when you know. It's like with anything, you cannot get in there and solve this issue or problem for their life, but you can ask the right questions in the right language. To just check in on the person and see that they're okay, but also understand the nonverbal and verbal cues. And that takes a little bit of self-awareness because, quite often the shame factor might have the person not want to trust you. You don't also want to just get in there because, you're being triggered by what's happening to that person. And in the pretense of sort of helping, you're actually not really protecting them. I think it's a very difficult question to actually answer. As you can see, I'm struggling a little bit because when you want to help somebody, I think it's actually more important to be able to create a vessel of space so that the person feels that they can trust you and that you are a trustworthy person as well. This is not about corporate culture. This is about what am I as a human being? If I'm going to step into somebody's personal situation and you want to help them, I need to be a trustworthy person.
Natalia, do you have anything before we switch over to Aisha?
Yeah, I do think this is a very difficult question, and without policies and a framework, it's really hard to give a clear answer. But I would say that two things can be really helpful in engaging with a colleague if you really think that something's going on for them. The first is just to see them. Hey, I notice you've been a bit tired or you've been a bit stressed. Do you want to talk about it? That's it. You're providing them the knowledge, hey, someone sees that I'm struggling, and you're providing an invitation which they can choose or not choose to take up. So the second part, which links to that, is choice. So in any relational exchange, we want to promote choice because this allows them to access their power, whereas in the other relational dynamic, they've been disempowered. So we don't want to insert ourselves. We want to let them know they've been seen, and we want to let them know they have a choice and that we're here if they're ready. And that would be the primary first step that I would suggest for colleagues and co-workers. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'm just going to hand it back to Aisha. I'm sharing our contact information. I hope everybody can see information about each of the speakers. Can you see my screen, ladies? So I'm just sharing that. And while we transition back to Aisha, thanks, Natalia. Thanks, Anita, so much for a wonderful conversation. And we have by no means covered the whole thing. This is just the beginning of a longer conversation. Aisha, back to you.
Thank you so much, ladies. I just have one final question. What is your, this is a question open to all three speakers. What is that one policy that you would like companies to adopt that they can take away from today's session? Maybe I'll start with you, Abam.
The first policy for me is one of just, I think I mentioned this before, it is critical to have the conversation first and foremost. We assume that the conversation is happening. It's actually not happening in a lot of places. So for me, before we get to policies, because you have to know how to implement these policies, a conversation needs to happen about what domestic violence is, why employers should care about it, and what employees can actually do about it. I think until that conversation happens, policies will not be effective, even if they're put in place.
Are we just taking turns? Okay, I'm going to
Yes, Anita, go ahead.
Well, I mean, it goes back to what I said before. You need to evaluate life with conscience. I think what's 2020 has brought around for everybody is that they're really, the lines are completely blurred, and they always were. It's just that people were putting on their, brave fronts to come to the workspace and be a certain person in the workspace and then go home and that's another workspace. But all the lines are blurred now. So if you're really interested, then I think it's time to evaluate life with conscience and, have the conversation, like Abam said, and decide, are you really interested to know? Because it will be a long journey. It will be a complex one, and it will also make us all uncomfortable. But it's through that discomfort that you actually have real policies and real evaluations and real systems in place that then make you a company that is completely conscious.
I really agree with both of you ladies. I think having the conversations is really important to understand what is happening and how can we spot it. It's all about the why and the what. Once we understand that, then we can start to build pathways to change. But the other thing that we could do right away is open channels for authentic communication from our teams, our employees, with a huge no shame policy attached to it. So even if we do not yet have all of the answers as how we're going to deal with it, what we can do right away is to eradicate the silence around it. At least when people are talking, they're no longer trapped inside themselves anymore. So it's a step. And as Anita said, it's going to take a lot of work to build out really beautiful systems that transform these experiences.
That's great. That's great. Thank you so much, ladies. And we come to the end of the session today. I would like to first thank our wonderful speakers, Abam, Anita, and Natalia, who have taken the time out of their personal and professional schedules. I'm very honored to be among courageous and accomplished women such as yourself. I would like to also thank KeyNote Women Speakers for their support of this event, and not forgetting you, our participants, and the organizations involved in creating this event, bringing us all together in a call to action for a safer and more supportive workplaces of the future. Now, your perspective matters to us. We would like to hear from you, and please do give us your feedback via the QR code on the screen or the link in the chat box below. So have a great week ahead, everyone, and take care.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everyone.